peaceful village of St. Mary Mead had always been a place where nothing ever seemed out of place. Its cobbled streets, the quiet, well-tended gardens, the familiar faces of the villagers, all of it gave the impression of a town untouched by time or trouble. It was a place where secrets were rarely kept, where gossip was whispered over cups of tea, where the most scandalous event in recent memory had been the late Miss Pettibone's cat running off with the baker's prize, turkey. Life in St. Mary Mead was slow, predictable, and safe. Chapter 01. That was, till the day of the Harvest Festival. It had all started so innocuously. The festival was a long-standing tradition, the highlight of the year in the village, and this year's event was no different. Children ran about the square with painted faces, the smell of roasting meats and fresh-baked pies wafting through the air, and the sound of laughter and music filled every corner. The entire village had come out for the occasion, eager to celebrate the harvest and enjoy the simple pleasures of the season. Miss Marple, as usual, had arrived early, quietly observing the preparations and chatting with a few of the villagers. She happened to cross paths with us. She was not one for loud celebrations, preferring to sit at the edge of the crowd and take in the events with the sort of watchful eye she had honed over the years. She had never been one for idle chatter, preferring to listen more than speak, always noting the subtle exchanges, the way a person's expression might shift when a topic was broached, or the way an innocent remark could reveal a hidden truth. It was at precisely this moment, as Miss Marple stood by the cider booth, sipping a glass of warm, spiced drink, that the quiet hum of the festival was shattered by a sudden, shrill scream. The sound cut through the noise of the crowd like a knife, drawing everyone's attention toward the source of the cry. The scream came from the direction of the village green, where the annual cake-baking contest was taking place. People turned, frozen in confusion and concern, as the crowd parted to reveal a small group of villagers gathered around the base of the old oak tree. In the middle of the group, clutching a pale, trembling hand to her chest, stood Miss Henrietta Ford, the village's beloved schoolteacher. She was staring down at something on the ground with a look of sheer horror on her face. "Miss Ford, what's wrong?" someone called out, stepping forward. Miss Ford's voice was trembling as she spoke. There's a body," she gasped. "A man lying dead under the tree." Hushed silence fell over the crowd. People stared, unsure whether to move forward or back, unsure of what to make of the chilling scene unfolding before them. Miss Marple, who'd always been one to trust her instincts, could feel the change in the air. It wasn't just the shock of a sudden death. It was the heavy presence of something hidden beneath the surface. The villagers, so accustomed to peace and civility, were now confronted with something they couldn't ignore. The local constable, Mr. Hawkins, was quick to arrive at the scene, pushing through the crowd with a look of authority that did little to mask the anxiety in his eyes. "Step back, everyone," he ordered. "Let's give him some space." Miss Marple, always composed, stepped forward slowly, her keen eyes taking in every detail. She saw Miss Ford, still clutching her chest, the distress on her face deepening as Hawkins bent over the body. The dead man lay motionless on the grass, his face obscured by the shadow of the tree. But there was no mistaking the unnatural angle of his limbs and the strange stillness of his form. "Who is he?" Hawkins muttered to himself, bending closer to examine the man. It was then that Miss Marple saw the small details that others might have missed. The man's shoes were polished, his suit expensive-looking, and his hands, though cold and stiff, now seemed to be carefully manicured with the faintest smudge of ink on the fingers. The ink was the first thing to catch Miss Marple's attention, a small, seemingly insignificant detail, but one that immediately suggested the man was a professional, perhaps a lawyer, or someone who dealt with important documents. Hawkins stood up slowly, his face pale, his brow furrowed. "I don't recognize him," he said. "We need to get him to the constable's office, see if we can identify him." Miss Marple took a slow step forward, her mind already piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. She had seen this before, in 100 small details, the careful precision of a death that didn't appear accidental. So the man's death wasn't just an unfortunate accident or a heart attack. It was deliberate, calculated, and for some reason, someone had gone to great lengths to hide the circumstances surrounding it. As the constable and a few others took the body away, Miss Marple caught the eye of Miss Ford, still standing at the edge of the crowd, her face ashen. Miss Marple gave her a reassuring smile and walked over. "Miss Ford, do you know this man?" she asked gently. Miss Ford shook her head, her hands still trembling. "No," she whispered, "I don't. But there's something familiar about him. I think I've seen him before, maybe at one of the meetings. I just can't place him." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her mind turning over the information. She had been around long enough to know that when people began second-guessing their memories, something important was being overlooked. Miss Ford's hesitance was telling. It was not just that the dead man was unfamiliar, it was that he was familiar in a way that Miss Ford couldn't quite explain. "Don't worry, Miss Ford," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle yet reassuring. "I'm sure the constable will figure this out. But if you think of anything, no matter how small, please let me know." Miss Ford nodded, still looking unsettled, before walking away with the others. Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on the retreating figure of the body, now covered with a sheet. As the last of the crowd dispersed, she felt the nagging sensation in the back of her mind, the feeling that there was more to this than a simple death. It was as if the very fabric of the village had been torn open, and beneath it, something dark and secret was waiting to be exposed. Miss Marple stood there for a long time, quietly observing the village as it returned to its mundane rhythms. The harvest festival, which had begun with such joy and expectation, now felt like a distant memory, overshadowed by the murder. The villagers had no idea yet what had been set in motion, but Miss Marple knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary death. It was the beginning of a mystery. And Miss Marple was already a step ahead, watching and waiting as the pieces began to fall into place. ChatGPT said, "The village of St. Mary Mead was not accustomed to chaos. It was the kind of place where daily life moved at a deliberate pace, nothing too slow. People had time for each other, and any disruption to this rhythm was immediately noticed. The murder of the stranger under the old oak tree, however, was a shock to the entire community. The revelation hit like a thunderclap, and the village would never be the same again as news of the death spread. The peaceful hum of gossip that had long characterized the village escalated into something more anxious, more urgent. By mid-afternoon, groups of villagers had gathered in clusters at various points in the village, on the steps of the bakery, by the pub, outside the village, haulage group, eager to discuss the death and try to piece together the details. No one had seen it coming. Who was the man? Why was he murdered? And most importantly, what had brought him to St. Mary Mead in the first place? Miss Marple, as was her habit, listened more than she spoke. She had learned long ago that people's true thoughts often came out when they weren't aware someone was paying attention. As she strolled slowly past the groups, she heard snippets of conversation from various directions. "I heard he was a lawyer," Mrs. Partridge said in a hushed tone, standing with her hands clasped at the village's front gate. "You know, all those documents he was carrying looked like some important legal papers to me." "Oh, stop gossiping, Mrs. Partridge," came the scornful reply from Mrs. Ellison, a sharp-tongued widow known for her opinionated remarks. "We don't know that. He might have just been passing through. I'd say he's just another city fellow coming here to escape the hustle and bustle, only to meet his untimely end." A small group of children, standing just off to the side, whispered to one another. "I heard it was Mrs. Darby who saw him first, standing by the churchyard. She said he had strange eyes, didn't she? Always staring at the church like he knew something he wasn't supposed to. Miss Marple paused at that particular comment. Mrs. Darby was a figure of some repute in the village. It was unusual to hear her name mentioned in relation to someone's death. She had always maintained a veneer of proper distance from the rest of the villagers, yet here was this mention of a peculiar interaction. Miss Marple's interest was piqued as she made her way toward the village square. Her eyes scanned the small groups of people huddled together, their voices overlapping, blending into an indistinct hum of suspicion and half-formed theories. The more Miss Marple listened, the more she felt certain that the villagers, though genuinely concerned, were completely missing the point. Poor dear Miss Ford. Mrs. Pettibone sighed, shaking her head. She saw the body, you know. I don't know how she's going to sleep tonight, with that dreadful image in her mind. Yes, and you can't blame her, said another villager. I would have fainted dead away myself if I had seen it. Potty, right there in broad daylight for everyone to see. The speculation grew with each passing moment, every word adding a new layer to the mystery. Each villager had their own theory, their own assumption about who the man might have been and why he had died, but Miss Marple knew better. The truth was often hidden beneath the surface, and the more people speculated, the more they muddied the waters. She had always been careful with her own deductions, waiting until the pieces fit together rather than leaping to conclusions, and she was certain that what the villagers were doing, no speculating, without any solid facts would only lead them further astray. Miss Marple made her way toward the bakery, where a few familiar faces had gathered. Mrs. Treadwell, the baker's wife, was handing out slices of freshly baked bread to a couple of the village's younger men, who had been helping with the festival's cleanup. Miss Marple, have you heard the news? Mrs. Treadwell asked, her voice warm but tinged with anxiety. The police are saying it wasn't an accident. A man's been murdered right here in our village, and they don't know who he is. How strange, isn't it? Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. Indeed, very strange. But you know, Mrs. Treadwell, there's one thing I've learned over the years. It's never as simple as it first appears. It's always something we've missed. The baker's wife, eager to offer her own theory, leaned in closer. Oh, I think it's someone from the outside. One of those city types. Come here to stir up trouble. They always do, you know. They think they can come here and get away with anything because it's so quiet. Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. She took a long, slow sip from her teacup before speaking again. Perhaps, but I think we mustn't be too quick to judge. The man's death was no random act of violence. There's something deliberate about it, something that suggests it's connected to more than just an unfortunate meeting of strangers. Mrs. Treadwell's eyes widened. You don't think it's something we should be worried about, do you, Miss Marple? Miss Marple smiled politely, her eyes twinkling with her usual calm wisdom. I wouldn't worry just yet, Mrs. Treadwell, but I would suggest that we pay attention to the small things. It's the smallest details that often hold the key. As Miss Marple left the bakery and walked back toward the center of the village, she couldn't help but reflect on the conversations she had overheard. The villagers were lost in their own theories, but they were missing something crucial. The man's death wasn't a random act of violence, nor was it an isolated incident. There was a connection, and she was determined to find it. The mention of Mrs. Darby earlier kept coming back to her, nagging at the edge of her mind. There was something there, something that needed to be explored further. She had always known that Mrs. Darby, with her cool composure and her tightly held secrets, was a woman with more depth than the village had given her credit for. There was always something lurking beneath the surface, something she had worked hard to conceal. And Miss Marple was certain that, if she could find the right thread to pull, everything would begin to unravel. That evening, as Miss Marple sat in her cozy cottage, She began to write down her thoughts, sorting through the theories she had already heard and organizing them in her mind. She knew she had to be patient. She had learned long ago that every mystery had its time to unfold. But as the days went on, the pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together. The man's identity would soon be uncovered, and the hidden truth behind his death would finally emerge. And when it did, the village of St. Mary Mead would never be the same. For now, Miss Marple could only wait and observe, allowing the threads to pull themselves into a clearer pattern. The game was afoot, and it was only a matter of time before the final revelation came to light. 2 CHPTERO2. The next morning dawned over. St. Mary Mead, with the promise of another beautiful, crisp autumn day. But beneath the clear skies, the air felt different. Tension had settled like an unseen weight on the village, and the usual rhythms of life seemed subtly off. The quiet gossip that had begun yesterday about the murder had given way to more hushed discussions as the day progressed. People moved with purpose, but the unease was evident in their eyes, in the way they looked over their shoulders or murmured when they thought no one was listening. The once serene village felt alive with suspicion, each shadow holding a secret, each passerby a potential witness to something far deeper than they cared to admit. Miss Marple, however, was not swayed by the growing nervousness. She knew all too well that panic only clouded one's judgment, and that the path to the truth could not be found in speculation, no matter how tantalizing. She moved through the village with her usual quiet, serving with care and precision, noticing things that others might overlook. Her sharp mind absorbed every detail, the way the villagers spoke, the pauses in conversation, the lingering glances exchanged behind closed doors. Nothing escaped her notice. Her first stop was the village square, where the body had been found. The ground still bore the faintest traces of the event-disturbed grass and the remnants of police tape. Hawkins had done his best to cordon off the area, but the curiosity of the villagers had already taken its toll. Some had already wandered close to the site, eyeing the ground where the stranger had fallen, their voices low, hushed with the weight of their theories. Miss Marple's first observation, however, had little to do with the dead man. It was the curious absence of the usual street vendors and market stalls that caught her attention. Normally, the square would be alive with the usual morning bustle, fruit sellers arranging their wares, children running through the cobbled streets. But today, everything was eerily quiet. It was as though the village had been put on pause, frozen by the weight of the mystery. As Miss Marple surveyed the area, her eyes settled on the familiar figure of Constable Hawkins, standing by the fountain in the middle of the square. His face was set in a grim expression as he spoke with a few of the villagers. He had noticed her approach, and she took the opportunity to slip closer, hoping to glean some new insight into the investigation. "I'll tell you this much, Hawkins," said one of the men in the small crowd, a tall, wiry fellow by the name of Mr. Harris. "This wasn't just some random attack. That man, wherever he was, wasn't from around here. He had money. You can see that much just by looking at him. And there's no way someone like him would wander into our village just to be murdered. It's got to be someone close to home." Hawkins nodded, but looked uncomfortable. "That's what we're trying to figure out, Harris. We've already sent for identification, but until we hear back, there's little to go on." "That's the problem, isn't it?" Harris pressed. "No one knows who he is, and everyone's got their own theory. Someone must know something." Miss Marple, now close enough to overhear the conversation clearly, took a slow breath, letting the words sink in. She had always been fond of Mr. Harris. He was intelligent and observant, a good conversationalist, though he did tend to be quick to form conclusions. Still, his observation about the man's appearance struck her as astute. The stranger had been dressed in fine clothes, the sort one wouldn't expect to see in a village like St. Mary Mead, unless the person was someone of means or significance. But there was something else, something she hadn't yet put her finger on. I agree with you, Eris, Miss Marple said, stepping closer to the group. But I think we must be careful in jumping to conclusions. Sometimes the obvious suspect isn't the one who holds the key. Hawkins looked over, a faint smile playing at the corner of his lips. Miss Marple, you've been listening, haven't you? I suppose you've got a theory already. Miss Marple smiled politely, her sharp eyes scanning the square, watching as the villagers went about their business, still in the midst of whispered conversations. I'm simply observing, Constable, nothing more. But I do believe that we should look closely at the details. The man didn't just appear from nowhere. His presence here and his death are connected to something deeper than we might first realize. Hawkins sighed, a sound that was part frustration, part relief. I suppose that's why we're relying on you, Miss Marple. I'll keep you updated as we learn more. For now, we've got a job to do. Of course, Miss Marple replied, her voice steady and composed. But don't rush to conclusions, Hawkins. The answers will come in time, but they'll require patience and careful observation. As she turned away from the square, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. She had learned what she needed to know, at least for the moment. A body had been moved to the constable's office for identification, and Hawkins was already starting to form theories. The key to solving this mystery lay in understanding the person behind the crime, and that meant looking beyond the obvious. Her. Next up was the village pub, where several of the men who had been at the festival were gathering for a drink. The pub was a familiar place to Miss Marple, a spot where the villagers congregated to share news, swap stories, and sometimes revealed secrets they'd preferred to keep hidden. It was here that Miss Marple hoped to hear something that might give her the edge in understanding what had really happened. As she entered, the usual low hum of conversation paused for a moment, and a few of the men glanced up at her. Miss Marple had long been a fixture of the village, and the men, though they sometimes joked about her, respected her sharpness and clear mind. Kay knew she'd been quietly observing them for years, and some were still wary of her ability to discern more than they realized. She approached the bar, where the barman, Mr. Pierce, was busy polishing a glass. "Good morning, Mr. Pierce," Miss Marple said warmly. "I do hope I'm not interrupting your business." "Not at all, Miss Marple," Mr. Pierce replied, his tone friendly but slightly guarded. "What brings you in today? I assume you've heard about the tragic incident." "I have," Miss Marple said, her voice measured. "I wanted to speak with a few of the men who were at the festival yesterday. I'm sure you've heard the rumors, but I'm looking for something more than speculation. I'm looking for facts." Mr. Pierce set the glass down, his face going serious. "It's a dreadful business, Miss Marple. You're not the only one asking questions. Everyone's been talking about it more than I care to hear. But there's one thing you should know. A few of the fellows, when they saw the body, mentioned that they'd seen the man before, just a week ago. Strange fellow he was, not from around here. They said he was hanging around the edge of the village, watching people." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. This was new information that connected the dead man to the village in a way that Miss Marple had not yet considered. Who exactly saw him, Mr. Pierce?" "Oh, I'm not sure of the names," Mr. Pierce said, his eyes darting around the room. "But one of them's young George Andrews. He's around here somewhere. I'd speak to him if I were you, Miss Marple." With this new lead, Miss Marple gave Mr. Pierce a polite smile and left the pub, her mind turning. This was beginning to feel like more than just an isolated death. The stranger's presence in the village was becoming a more significant clue than she had initially thought. But she still had a long way to go before the pieces of the puzzle would fit together. As she made her way toward George Andrews' home, she couldn't shake the feeling that the key to the entire mystery was not just the man's death, but the strange, quiet web of connections that had brought him to St. Mary Mead in the first place, okay? And that, Miss Marple knew, was where the real investigation would begin. Miss Marple knew better than anyone that the most obvious answers were rarely the correct ones. The village of St. Mary Mead, for all its charm, was home to more secrets than most people would care to admit. And every person she encountered in her quiet walks had something to hide, whether they realized it or not. But as the investigation into the murder unfolded, Miss Marple's instincts told her that the mystery surrounding the stranger's death wasn't as simple as it first appeared. There was more at play here than mere happenstance. She spent the next few days carefully observing the village and speaking with a few of the locals, trying to piece together the strange and unsettling bits of information she had gathered. Most telling clue had come from the young George Andrews, who had mentioned seeing the dead man just a week before, standing at the edge of the village. The stranger had been watching people, watching them with an intensity that unsettled even the most seasoned of villagers. It was a kind of behavior that Miss Marple knew often preceded something far more dangerous. The next morning, Miss Marple visited George Andrews' home, a modest cottage on the outskirts of the village. George, a lanky young man with a nervous energy, greeted her hesitantly at the door. She had known him since he was a boy. His mother, a widow, had been a longtime friend of Miss Marple's. She had watched George grow up. Though George was generally well-liked, he had always had a peculiar way of looking at things, a tendency to notice what others missed. Miss Marple had always found him to be an honest and open young man, but she also knew that honesty didn't always mean understanding. "Good morning, Miss Marple," George greeted her, his voice a bit strained, as if he weren't entirely comfortable with the situation. "I didn't expect you to come by today. You've heard, then, about the man?" "Have indeed," Miss Marple said, her voice calm and reassuring. "I'd like to ask you a few questions, if you don't mind." George shifted uneasily from one foot to the other, his eyes darting to the ground. "I suppose I can't say no, can I? My mother's told me to be polite." Miss Marple gave him a kind smile. "Of course, George. I'm only looking for a bit of information. You see, you mentioned that you saw the man before, didn't you?" George nodded quickly, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "Yes, I did. A week ago, I saw him standing by the old oak tree, just outside the village. He was watching the people who walked by. It was strange, Miss Marple. I thought it was odd at the time, but I didn't think much of it. It was like he was waiting for something." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her mind turning over the implications of this new detail. "Waiting for something, you say? Did he seem agitated, or was he simply standing there quietly?" George bit his lip, recalling the moment. It was hard to tell, really. He didn't move much, just stood still, watching. But his eyes. There was something in his eyes, like he was waiting for someone, but he didn't want to be seen, and then he disappeared into the woods. That was the last time I saw him. Miss Marple's heart raced slightly. The man's behavior was certainly odd, but it also seemed too deliberate to be the action of a mere wanderer or a lost soul. There was a purpose behind his actions. She needed to know more about him, about who he had been and why he had been there in the first place. "Did you mention this to anyone else?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle but probing. George hesitated. "No, Miss Marple. Didn't want to make a fuss. I thought it might just be some traveler, someone passing through. It wasn't until I heard about the murder that I realized what I saw was ... important." Miss Marple nodded, her mind working quickly. There were too many unanswered questions, but there was something about George's nervousness that made her wonder whether he knew more than he was letting on. Could he have seen something else? Something he hadn't yet realized was significant. "I understand, George," Miss Marple said, giving him a comforting smile. "But I must ask, do you know if anyone else saw this man someone who might have been closer to him or seen him speaking to anyone? George looked away, his brow furrowing in thought. Well, there was Mrs. Darby. I saw her walking near the same spot, and she looked like she was talking to someone. She was, looking at him, I think. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now it seems important. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. Mrs. Darby. The mention of her name sent a ripple through Miss Marple's thoughts. Mrs. Darby had always been a fixture in the village, known for her social status and wealth, but also for her quiet, watchful demeanor. There were many rumors about her past, whispers about her connections to powerful people outside the village. And now, this strange man had been seen in her vicinity. Mrs. Darby, you say? Miss Marple repeated, her voice calm but purposeful. Did you notice anything unusual about their conversation? George shook his head. No, I didn't hear what they said. But she was certainly looking at him, and there was a sort of tension in the way they stood, like they knew each other, but she didn't want to be seen with him. Miss Marple smiled softly, her mind already racing with possibilities. Thank you, George. You've been very helpful, and if you remember anything else, no matter how small, please let me know. As she left George's cottage, Miss Marple's thoughts were already consumed by the significance of the new information. Mrs. Darby's connection to the man, however fleeting it might have been, was no coincidence. Miss Marple had always trusted her instincts, something about the way George had described Mrs. Darby's interaction with the stranger made her think that the Darby family was at the heart of this mystery. Whether they were directly involved in the murder or simply connected to something deeper, Miss Marple could not yet say. But she knew one thing. Mrs. Darby was no innocent bystander. As Miss Marple made her way back into the heart of the village, she couldn't shake the feeling that the pieces were beginning to fall into place. The puzzle was far from complete, but the first threads of the story were being woven together. The next step was to see Mrs. Darby. A conversation with her could reveal more than Miss Marple could imagine. For now, the investigation was still in its early stages, but Miss Marple had a sense that the village of St. Mary Mead was about to find itself entangled in a web of secrets that had been hidden for far too long. There was a story here, one that the villagers were too blind to see. But Miss Marple, as always, was ahead of the game. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered, and she was determined to find it. Chapter 03. The village of St. Mary Mead was quieter than usual in the days following the murder, the air thick with unease. Though the festival had long been forgotten in the wake of the tragedy, the usual hum of village life continued, albeit with a strained undercurrent. Whispers filled the streets, and eyes seemed to linger longer than they should, filled with suspicion and curiosity. It was as though the murder had stripped away the familiar facade of the village, exposing a hidden layer of secrets beneath. Miss Marple, ever watchful and deliberate, spent the next few days quietly moving through the village, observing the behavior of the townsfolk. Her intuition told her that there was more to the death than the villagers suspected, and she was determined to uncover the truth. Every conversation, every subtle shift in attitude was another clue in the puzzle that was unfolding before her. After her conversation with George Andrews, Miss Marple felt certain that Mrs. Darby was central to the mystery, but she needed to gather more information. The brief encounter George had witnessed between Mrs. Darby and the dead man raised more questions than it answered. Why had Mrs. Darby been speaking to a man she likely didn't know? And why had she been so intent on not being seen with him? Her next stop was, of course, Mrs. Darby's home, an imposing, ivy-covered manor that had long been the symbol of wealth and influence in St. Mary Mead. It was a place where Miss Marple had spent many pleasant afternoons over tea, though the memory of those visits now seemed distant and tainted by the dark cloud of suspicion that had begun to gather around Mrs. Darby. When Miss Marple arrived, she was greeted by the housekeeper, who led her into the drawing room. Mrs. Darby was sitting by the window, her fingers gently tracing the edge of a teacup. She appeared more fragile than Miss Marple remembered, her usual poise diminished by the weight of the events that had unfolded. Her face was pale, and there was a noticeable lack of the usual composure that had always marked her presence in the village. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Darby said, her voice softer than usual, a hint of strain in her words. "What brings you here today?" "I've come to speak with you, Mrs. Darby," Miss Marple replied calmly, her voice measured. "I've been thinking about the man who was found dead in the village, and I believe you may have seen something important. Perhaps you could help me understand more about him." Mrs. Darby's eyes flickered with a brief flash of alarm before she masked it with a composed smile. "I don't know much about him, Miss Marple. It's a tragedy, of course, but I've told Constable Hawkins all I know. He was a stranger to the village, and I simply happened to pass by." Miss Marple nodded slowly, carefully noting the shift in Mrs. Darby's demeanor. Her voice remained soft, but there was an undeniable firmness to it. "I understand, but I've heard something rather interesting. Witness young George Andrews saw you speaking to the man the day before he was found. Is that true?" The mention of George's name caused Mrs. Darby to stiffen ever so slightly, her fingers tightening around her teacup. "George Andrews. Yes, I did see him," she said after a moment, though her voice was less certain. "Okay, but I didn't speak to him for long. We exchanged pleasantries, nothing more." Miss Marple tilted her head, sensing that Mrs. Darby was not being entirely forthcoming. "But it's strange, isn't it, Mrs. Darby? Stranger in the village, someone who clearly didn't belong here, and you just happened to pass by and exchange a few words? What did he say to you?" For the first time in their conversation, Mrs. Darby looked away, her gaze drifting to the window. She seemed to be collecting her thoughts, carefully choosing her next words. "I'm afraid I can't remember everything," she said at last, her voice tinged with an almost imperceptible hesitation. "It was all rather trivial, I'm sure." Miss Marple watched her intently, her sharp eyes never leaving Mrs. Darby's face. She had been in this position many times before, speaking with people who were reluctant to share the truth. She could sense the strain in Mrs. Darby's words. It's a subtle but unmistakable sign that there was more to this encounter than she was letting on. "I see," Miss Marple said, her tone soft but pointed. "But you do recall the man? It's what struck you about him. What did he seem to want?" For a long moment, Mrs. Darby didn't respond. Then, slowly, she set her teacup down on the saucer and stood. Her voice was low as she spoke. "I told him that he didn't belong here, that people like him don't stay in villages like ours for long. He didn't seem offended, just ... curious. It was strange. I felt like he was waiting for something, or someone, okay? But I can't say why I felt that way. It was just a feeling." Marple's heart skipped a beat. This was the crucial moment. The stranger wasn't just in the village by accident. He was there for a purpose, and Mrs. Darby had felt it too. He had been waiting for something or someone. "What else did he say?" Miss Marple pressed gently. "Did he ask any questions about the village? About anyone in particular?" Mrs. Darby's face tightened, and for a brief moment, Miss Marple thought she might break down. But instead, the mask of composure returned. "I don't recall exactly. I must have imagined it. I told him that he should leave, that he had no place here." Miss Marple stood up, her gaze never leaving Mrs. Darby. "I don't believe you, Mrs. Darby. You know more than you're letting on. I think you've known this man longer than you've admitted, and I think you're hiding something." Tension in the room was palpable, and for a moment, Miss Marple felt a strange shift in the air. Mrs. Darby's expression faltered, her lips parting as if she were about to speak, but then she closed them again, her hands wringing in her lap. I don't know what you're talking about," Mrs. Darby said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "You're mistaken, Miss Marple. I'm not hiding anything. Miss Marple was already moving, her mind racing with the pieces of the puzzle that were falling into place. Perhaps not, Mrs. Darby, but I believe you are protecting someone, and that someone is connected to the death of the man in the village square. The truth is not as simple as you want it to be. She turned toward the door, her back to Mrs. Darby, but her words hung in the air like a final challenge. I'll be in touch again soon, Mrs. Darby. I suggest you think very carefully about what you're willing to share with me. With that, Miss Marple left the room, spit swirling with new insights. Mrs. Darby's carefully crafted story had begun to unravel. There was something, more something hidden beneath the surface. The village was still full of secrets, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover every one of them as she walked back through the village. The fog of uncertainty seemed to lift slightly. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, but there were still many questions to answer. Who was the dead man, and why had he come to St. Mary Mead? Why had Mrs. Darby been so reluctant to tell the truth? The mystery was far from over, but Miss Marple had learned one important thing. The truth, no matter how carefully concealed, always found its way to the surface, and she was determined to uncover it, no matter how long it took. The village of St. Mary Mead had never seemed so alive with suspicion. Every villager Miss Marple passed seemed to move with a quiet sense of urgency. The casual chatter that once filled the streets, now replaced by hushed tones and furtive glances. There was an undeniable undercurrent of fear hanging over the villager, fear that something once hidden was now being uncovered, piece by piece. And yet, despite the nervous energy, the village was still largely unaware of the true depth of the mystery that had been set into motion. Miss Marple had already gathered some key details about the dead man, but there was still so much she didn't know. Mrs. Darby's reluctance to provide any substantial information about her encounter with the stranger had only deepened the mystery. Her evasive responses, her uncomfortable glances, these were all signs that she knew more than she was letting on. It was clear to Miss Marple that Mrs. Darby was hiding something, but what? After a conversation with Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple decided to take another approach. She needed to speak with someone who might know more about the stranger's background, someone who could shed light on his identity. Her thoughts turned to the village's small but tight-knit group of local historians and genealogists, group that often gathered at the town hall on Thursday afternoons to discuss the village's long history. Perhaps they had seen this man before, or maybe they could point her in the direction of records that might reveal something more. As the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, Miss Marple made her way to the town hall. The building, though modest, had an old-world charm to it, with ivy creeping up its stone walls and large windows that overlooked the village green. Inside, the scent of old books and parchment greeted her, and the hum of quiet conversation filled the air. It was a place where the past seemed to linger, waiting to be uncovered. Miss Marple entered the main hall, where a small group of villagers were gathered around a large wooden table, engrossed in conversation. Among them was Mrs. Greenway, the village's unofficial historian, a woman with a keen eye for detail and a sharp memory. She was sitting at the head of the table, her glasses perched on the tip of her nose as she flipped through a thick book of village records. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Greenway." Miss Marple greeted her warmly. "Hey, I hope I'm not interrupting. Anything important?" Mrs. Greenway looked up and smiled at Miss Marple, her face lighting up in recognition. "Oh, not at all, Miss Marple. Always a pleasure to see you. We're just going over some of the old records. You're welcome to join us, if you'd like." Miss Marple declined the offer, instead taking a seat nearby where she could observe and listen. The villagers, deep in their discussions, seemed to be mostly focused on the village's history. Miss Marple's sharp ears caught snippets of their conversation. "You know," said Mr. Holbrook, one of the older men in the group, "there's always been something strange about the Darby family Ever since they came here, things have never quite been the same. Funny how no one ever really questions them, isn't it? Miss Marple's attention sharpened. The Darby family again. She had suspected that there was more to their story than met the eye. And now she was beginning to believe that they were at the center of everything that had happened. Mrs. Darby's evasiveness, combined with the stranger's presence in the village, pointed to a connection that she couldn't ignore. I've been meaning to go through the Darby family's old records, Mrs. Greenway said, her voice thoughtful. I'm sure there's more to their story than we've been told. Where to start? She looked down at her notes, as if the answer might be buried in the pages. Miss Marple took a moment before speaking, careful to let the conversation unfold naturally. I've been curious about that myself, Mrs. Greenway, she said, her voice light and friendly. You know, the Darby family has always seemed a bit enigmatic. Do you know when they first came to St. Mary Mead, Mrs. July? Greenway looked up from her notes, her expression thoughtful. Oh, the Darbys have been here for decades, Miss Marple. They moved here sometime in the early 1900s, I believe. Built that grand house of theirs on the outskirts of town. Ever since, they've been a prominent family, though you'll never hear them talk much about their past. It's all very hush-hush, as they say. Miss Marple nodded, her curiosity piqued. And have you found any old records about the family, perhaps from the time they first arrived? Any documents that might shed light on their activities? Mrs. Greenway paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the open book. Not yet, but there are some letters and journals from a few of the old families in the village. Some of them knew the Darbys when they first arrived. I haven't gotten around to going through them all, but I suspect there are details there that might explain a few things. Miss Marple's mind raced as she processed the information. The Darby family had been in the village for decades, long enough to build a network of connections that stretched far beyond the borders of St. Mary Mead, and if their reputation had been carefully cultivated, Miss Marple knew that the truth was likely buried under layers of carefully guarded secrets. She couldn't help but feel that she was on the verge of uncovering something significant, something that tied the Darbys, the stranger, and the murder together. But she needed more than just whispers and vague references. She needed hard evidence. Would it be possible for me to take a look at those letters and journals, Mrs. Greenway? Miss Marple asked, her voice polite but insistent. I believe they might hold the key to understanding the connections between the Darby family and the events unfolding now. Mrs. Greenway hesitated for a moment before nodding. Of course, Miss Marple. I don't see why not. I'll gather the materials for you tomorrow. You can come by then, if you like. Thank you, Miss Marple said, her heart quickening at the thought of what might be hidden in those old records. I'll make sure to stop by. As she left the town hall, Miss Marple's thoughts were already racing ahead. The Darby family was at the center of this mystery, but how far did their influence reach? The stranger who had been murdered, his strange behavior, and the cryptic conversations between him and Mrs. Darby were all parts of a larger story that Miss Marple was only just beginning to uncover. There was something deeply unsettling about the way the village was reacting to the murder. The fear in the air was palpable, and the eagerness with which people spoke of the Darbys' wealth and power only confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion that they were not the innocent victims they appeared to be. Whoever the dead man was, and whatever he had uncovered, his death was no accident. Miss Marple knew she was getting closer to the truth, but there were still many questions left unanswered. The murder had set everything in motion, but it was only the beginning. She would need to sift through the past, carefully examine the old records, and continue asking the right questions until the full story came into focus. And when it did, Miss Marple was certain that the village of St. Mary Mead would never look the same again. ChatGPT said, Chapter 04. Miss Marple arrived at the village hall the following morning, the early mist still hanging in the air as she made her way through. the cobbled streets. The town was waking up, its usual quietness disturbed only by the occasional chatter of the early risers. But today, there was an underlying current of anxiety, a subtle unease that she could sense in the way people moved, the way they spoke. Her mind was fully occupied with the Darby family. There was something off about their composure. Mrs. Darby's sudden shift in behavior, the man's mysterious appearance in the village, and the cryptic conversation between them were all pieces of a puzzle Miss Marple had yet to solve. Mrs. Darby had been hiding something. She could feel it. Despite her polished facade, Miss Marple stepped inside the village hall, greeted by the warm smell of dust and aged paper. Mrs. Greenway was already waiting for her by the table where she kept her historical records. The table was covered with old maps, books, and yellowing letters, a window into the past that Miss Marple knew could provide vital answers. "Ah, Miss Marple," Mrs. Greenway said with a smile, though it was laced with concern. "I've gone through the letters and journals I mentioned. They're all here, but you should be careful. Some of the older entries are hard to read. Al, be cautious," Miss Marple replied, her tone steady. She had spent a lifetime reading between the lines, noticing what others missed. "Thank you for gathering these." As Miss Marple settled into her chair, she began carefully turning the pages of the first journal, her eyes scanning the handwriting, searching for anything that might connect the Darby family to the stranger, or, more troubling still, to the murder. The letters were filled with innocuous details about village life, but as Miss Marple dug deeper, he found references to the Darby family's early years in the village, mention of their rapid rise in influence, generous donations to local causes, and most notably, their unspoken connections with powerful families beyond St. Mary Mead. One particular letter caught her attention. It was dated almost 20 years ago, written by an unknown writer, but addressed to Mrs. Darby's late husband, a T. The language was formal, but the tone was unmistakably urgent. "I trust you understand the gravity of the matter I have presented." The letter began. "The deal we've discussed is critical. We cannot afford to have anyone dig deeper into our affairs, especially not the Farnsworth family. They are getting too close to uncovering the details of our transactions. If necessary, we must take decisive action." Miss Marple's heart quickened as she read the letter again. The Farnsworth family. Lillian's father had been investigating the Darby family, hadn't he? That was why he had been silenced. The letter's veiled threat was unmistakable, and it confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. The Darbys had been involved in something far more sinister than anyone in St. Mary Mead had realized. She glanced up at Mrs. Greenway, who had been quietly watching her read. "Who wrote this letter?" Miss Marple asked, her voice tight with anticipation. Mrs. Greenway peered at the letter and frowned. "It's hard to say. The handwriting is very elegant, but the paper is thick, not like anything the villagers would use. It's possible it came from someone outside of St. Mary Mead, perhaps even from London. But that would require more investigation, and I'm afraid the records don't give us a name." Miss Marple's mind was already working through the possibilities. The letter confirmed that there had been a deep, long-standing connection between the Darbys and someone outside the village. More than that, it suggested that the Darbys had been hiding something far darker than simple financial dealings. The mention of taking decisive action could be seen as a veiled reference to the murder of Lillian's father, someone who had been close to uncovering the truth. The mystery was now clearer, but the full picture was still out of reach. As Miss Marple folded the letter and set it aside, Mrs. Greenway spoke again. "Miss Marple, I know you must have your suspicions, but I must admit everything I've seen points to Mrs. Darby's involvement in something much bigger than we've ever realized. But you must be careful. These aren't just village secrets. There are powerful forces at play here, and if you push too hard, you may find yourself in dangerous waters." Miss Marple met Mrs. Greenway's gaze, her expression calm but resolute. "Spent my life watching people Mrs. Greenway. The truth is always hidden behind the faces people show the world. And when someone goes to great lengths to protect their secrets, it's usually because those secrets can destroy everything they've worked for. Mrs. Greenway nodded, but Miss Marple could see the flicker of concern in her eyes. I understand, Miss Marple. Just be cautious. There's more at stake here than you know. Miss Marple took one final look at the letter before standing up. Thank you, Mrs. Greenway. I'm sure we'll be able to uncover more. But for now, I must go. There's one more person I need to speak with before I move forward. Quiet village of St. Mary Mead was beginning to feel like a pressure cooker, each piece of the puzzle pushing the mystery closer to the boiling point. Miss Marple knew that the next step would bring her face to face with Mrs. Darby once more. This time, however, it would be a confrontation, not a polite conversation. As she left the town hall, her thoughts were consumed with the letter and the secrets it had revealed. The Darby family was at the center of this web, but there were still many unanswered questions. Why had the stranger come to St. Mary Mead? What had he discovered? And how did Mrs. Darby fit into it all? But there was something else, something nagging at the back of Miss Marple's mind. The mention of the Farnsworth family in the letter was no coincidence. Lillian's father had been investigating the Darbys long before the murder. If the Darbys had wanted to protect their secrets, they would have gone to extreme lengths. And Miss Marple suspected that Lillian herself was connected to the key that would unlock the final mystery. As she walked through the village, heading toward the Darby estate, Miss Marple's mind was already piecing together the final connections. Mrs. Darby's time was running out. She had been hiding for too long. But Miss Marple was ready to bring the truth to the surface. The next few days would be pivotal, and Miss Marple could feel the weight of the coming confrontation. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, and soon the village of St. Mary Mead would know the truth. But for now, Miss Marple had one last meeting to attend, and she knew that once she uncovered where Mrs. Darby was hiding, the entire village would be shaken to its core. Tool's ChatGPT said the sun was low in the sky as Miss Marple made her way toward the Darby estate. The familiar path through the village, now carrying a sense of inevitability. The quiet, well-kept gardens, the imposing manor, and the long drive leading to the front door all seemed to mock her growing sense of urgency. She had spent days piecing together fragments of conversations, analyzing Mrs. Darby's every word, and observing the patterns of behavior that had defined the village for years. But now she was closing in on the truth, and she could feel it in the air of the tension. The sense that everything was on the cusp of unraveling. Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the letter. She had discovered in the town hall a letter that had connected the Darby family to something much darker than mere financial dealings. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that Mrs. Darby had been hiding more than just money and power. The mention of the Farnsworth family in the letter, the cryptic warnings of decisive action, and the veiled references to a larger network outside St. Mary Mead, all pointed to a conspiracy that ran much deeper than anyone had realized. And Lillian Farnsworth, whose father had been murdered for uncovering the Darby family's secrets, was now at the center of it all. As Miss Marple reached the front door of the Darby estate, she felt a brief flicker of doubt. Mrs. Darby had been evasive, her responses carefully measured, but Miss Marple knew that the time for polite conversation was over. The woman had been hiding the truth for too long, and Miss Marple was certain that the answers she sought were buried beneath her carefully cultivated exterior. She knocked softly, but firmly, and the door opened within moments. The housekeeper, who had become somewhat of a fixture in the manor, greeted her with a forced smile. "Miss Marple," the housekeeper said, her voice polite but lacking its usual warmth. "Mrs. Darby is expecting you. Please, come in." Miss Marple stepped into the grand entrance hall, her eyes scanning the room as she walked. The house, once warm and welcoming, now seemed cold, its polished floors and ornate furniture casting long shadows in the fading light. There was an oppressive silence that hung in the air, as though the house itself were holding its breath. The housekeeper led Miss Marple to the drawing room, where Mrs. Darby was seated by the window, her back turned toward them. She appeared lost in thought, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but when she heard the sound of footsteps, she turned to face Miss Marple. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Darby said, her voice carrying the same polished calmness that had always defined her. "It's good to see you again. I trust you're well." "I'm quite well, thank you," Miss Marple replied, her voice warm but firm. "But I fear I cannot say the same for the situation at hand." Mrs. Darby's smile faltered ever so slightly, and her eyes flickered briefly toward the door as though considering an escape. But she quickly masked her discomfort, rising to her feet and gesturing to the seat across from her. "Please, have a seat. I assume you've come to discuss the events surrounding the ... tragic incident. I've already given my statement to the authorities, as I'm sure you're aware." Miss Marple sat down, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Darby's face. "Yes, I'm aware, but I believe there's more to this story than you've shared with the constable. See, Mrs. Darby, I've come to believe that the man who was found dead in the village square wasn't just some random traveler. He was here for a reason, and I think you know exactly why he came." The color drained from Mrs. Darby's face, and for a brief moment, Miss Marple could see the tension in her shoulders. The woman had been prepared for this conversation, but the weight of it seemed to be pressing down on her all at once. "I don't know what you mean," Mrs. Darby replied, though her voice was thin, strained. "I've already told you everything I know. The man was a stranger. I had no reason to." "Mrs. Darby," Miss Marple interrupted, her voice calm but unwavering. "Hey, I know you've been hiding something. You've been hiding it for years. The man didn't just stumble into St. Mary Mead by accident. He was looking for something that would expose you and your family for what you truly are. And I believe you knew him. I believe you were trying to keep him quiet." Mrs. Darby's eyes flashed with panic before she quickly composed herself. She straightened her shoulders, the calm mask of her social status returning. "I don't know what you're implying, Miss Marple, but I assure you, you're mistaken. There is nothing more to this than what has already been said." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharp and penetrating. "No, Mrs. Darby, I don't believe I'm mistaken. You've spent years building a reputation, a facade of respectability. But behind that, there's something darker, something you've tried to keep hidden. You and your late husband were involved in illegal dealings, weren't you? And when Lillian Farnsworth's father started digging, you did everything you could to stop him. And when he got too close, when he found something that threatened to expose you, you had him silenced." The words hung in the air, and for a long moment, Mrs. Darby said nothing. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tightly together, as though she was searching for the right response. But Miss Marple could see the flicker of fear. It's the crack in the carefully constructed facade. "You don't know what you're talking about?" Mrs. Darby said, finally, her voice quiet but trembling. "You think you understand, but you don't. My husband and I did what we had to do to protect our family. The things we were involved in, they weren't something that could just be swept away. People would have lost everything if the truth came out." Miss Marple's expression softened, though her voice remained firm. "I understand more than you think, Mrs. Darby. You and your husband may have believed that you could protect yourselves by keeping your secrets buried, but the truth has a way of coming to the surface, no matter how deeply it's hidden. And now, the truth is coming for you." Mrs. Darby closed her eyes, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the years of lies was finally catching up with her. She sat down slowly, her composure faltering for the first time. "I never wanted it to go this far," she whispered, her voice raw. "But once we started, there was no turning back. We tried to keep it contained, to keep everyone from knowing, but it was never enough. And now it's too late. Miss Marple's eyes softened, her tone gentle. You're right, Mrs. Darby. It is too late. But it's not too late to do the right thing. The village deserves to know what's been hidden, and I believe you're the key to unlocking the rest of the mystery. Mrs. Darby's gaze met Miss Marple's, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something more than just fear. It was resignation, a willingness to face what had been long buried. I'll tell you everything, Mrs. Darby said, quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll tell you what happened, but you must promise me one thing, Miss Marple. What is it? Miss Marple asked, leaning forward. Promise me that the truth will be told. All of it, not just the part that fits your story, but everything. The entire village must know what we've done, what we're all responsible for. Miss Marple nodded slowly. I promise, Mrs. Darby. But remember, the truth is not something we can control. Will come out, whether we're ready for it or not, okay? And when it does, it will change everything. With that, Mrs. Darby took a deep breath and began to speak, the words tumbling out in a quiet flood of confessions and regrets. Miss Marple listened carefully, the last piece of the puzzle falling into place, and as Mrs. Darby's revelations filled the room, Miss Marple knew that the truth was finally within reach. Chapter 5. The air in the drawing room seemed to grow heavier with every passing second as Mrs. Darby's confession continued. Miss Marple remained composed, listening intently to each word, her mind methodically processing the information. It was one thing to suspect the Darbys were hiding something, but hearing the full extent of their involvement in such a web of deceit was both chilling and, in some ways, expected. She had suspected there was more to the village's wealth and influence than met the eye, and now she was learning the ugly truth behind their power. Mrs. Darby's voice wavered as she spoke, but her words were firm, no longer the polished and controlled tones she had once used to maintain her reputation. She was unraveling, bit by bit, and Miss Marple was quietly, purposefully collecting the pieces of a larger picture that had eluded the village for so long. I never meant for it to go this far, Mrs. Darby said softly, her eyes staring at the floor. My husband and I, we thought we could keep everything under control. It was just supposed to be a bit of money, investments in land, businesses outside the village. But it grew, and soon there were people we couldn't control. People who demanded more. And Lillian's father, he was the one who got too close. He was too sharp, okay? He knew we were hiding something. He started digging, asking questions, so Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. The connection between Lillian's father and the Darbys was becoming clearer. The murder now seemed not only a tragic consequence of the Darbys' secret dealings, but also the final, fatal step in a long battle to silence a threat. We didn't mean for it to end in murder, Mrs. Darby continued, her voice hoarse. But when he started finding things out, my husband, okay, well, he did what he thought was necessary. We had to stop him. The man he worked with, Carter, he was the one who helped cover it up. Carter handled the worst of it, okay? He had connections, people who could make problems disappear, okay? The money we'd made it was all connected to the black market, deals that no one could afford to know about. But when it started to unravel, she paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath. Miss Marple's thoughts swirled. The black market, connections to shady individuals, a murder to cover it all up. It was becoming clearer with every sentence. Mrs. Darby's willingness to admit to her part in it spoke volumes. She had clearly been driven to this moment by desperation, but there was still something more to uncover. Miss Marple wasn't yet ready to believe the full picture had been revealed. I'll tell you everything. Miss Marple, Mrs. Darby whispered, her voice barely audible. "But you must promise me one thing." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes softening in recognition of Mrs. Darby's distress. "What is it, Mrs. Darby?" "Mrs. Me, you'll protect my daughter," Mrs. Darby implored. "Lillian has no idea what she's walked into. She thinks she can bring everything to light. She has no idea who she's dealing with. They'll come after her, Miss Marple. Please, don't let them." A flash of realization hit Miss Marple like a thunderclap. Lillian was now at the heart of this dangerous web, a pawn in a game she had yet to fully understand. The implications were clear. Lillian was not just a grieving daughter looking for justice. She was now a direct threat to a network of powerful people who had spent years building their empire on lies and illegal activities. And Lillian, for all her bravery, was in far deeper than she realized. "I will do everything in my power to protect her." "Mrs. Darby," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "But you must understand, the truth will not be buried. You cannot hide forever. And if we are to stop the harm from continuing, it must come out, every bit of it." Mrs. Darby nodded, her face stricken with regret. "I know, but what have we done, Miss Marple? My husband and I, we thought we could make it all go away. But now, it's all coming out, isn't it? The murder, the lies, the people we've hurt, it's all coming back." Miss Marple took a step closer, her presence calm and unyielding. "It's never too late to do what's right, Mrs. Darby. The village may be shaken by the truth, but the truth must come first. You cannot protect your family by continuing to shield them from the consequences of their actions." As the words left Miss Marple's lips, a heavy silence filled the room. Mrs. Darby looked defeated, as though the weight of her own choices had become too much to bear. Her entire world was crumbling, piece by piece, and there was no way to stop the inevitable tide of justice that was now set in motion. And yet, Miss Marple knew that even in the face of such despair, there was one last thing that Mrs. Darby could do to make amends. It was her final chance for redemption for herself and for her daughter. "Mrs. Darby," Miss Marple said softly, her voice compassionate yet firm, "you must go to the authorities. You must tell them everything. Only then can the village heal. Only then can Lillian be free from the dangers that await her." Mrs. Darby's hands trembled as she looked up at Miss Marple, her face etched with a deep sorrow. "I'll do it," she whispered. "I'll go to them, but I can't face Lillian. I can't." "You don't have to face her alone," Miss Marple reassured her. "We'll do this together, step by step." As Miss Marple turned to leave, she couldn't help but reflect on the gravity of the situation. The Darby family had built an empire on lies and manipulation, and now it was crumbling before them. Mrs. Darby's willingness to step forward was a sign that, despite everything, she still had a shred of honor left. But Miss Marple knew that the real work was yet to come. The village had been blind to the corruption that ran beneath its surface for far too long. And now the truth was about to be laid bare. Miss Marple had no illusions about the difficulty of what lay ahead. Exposing the full extent of the Darby's actions would shake the village to its very core. But Miss Marple was unyielding in her conviction. The truth, no matter how painful, had to be revealed, and it would be no matter the cost. As she walked away from the Darby estate, Miss Marple's mind was already racing. The pieces were falling into place. The time for hiding was over. The truth would come to light, and the village would have to confront it, no matter how uncomfortable it was. Mrs. Darby's confession was just the beginning. There was still much to uncover, and Miss Marple would see it through to the very end. The quiet village of St. Mary Mead was about to face its reckoning, and Miss Marple would be there, watching, waiting, as the truth finally took center stage. The air in St. Mary Mead felt thick with anticipation as Miss Marple walked the quiet streets towards the village square. The day was overcast, the sky heavy with clouds that seemed to mirror the weight of the truth now stirring in the heart of the village. For weeks, the villagers had speculated, whispered, and wondered. They had formed their own theories, some closer to the truth than others, but Miss Marple had known all along that the time for secrets was coming to an end. It was only a matter of when the final pieces would fall into place. Hey, and who would be left to face the consequences. Now, with Mrs. Darby's confession weighing heavily on her shoulders, the truth was poised to be revealed. The woman who had once been a pillar of the village was now one of its greatest sources of unrest, and as Miss Marple made her way to the square, her thoughts were clear. Today was the day. The village would be forced to face what it had been hiding. Miss Marple had carefully arranged for the villagers to gather in the square for a public meeting. Hawkins, the constable, had reluctantly agreed, knowing that Miss Marple's involvement had already set things in motion. He had no choice but to follow her lead, though he, like the rest of the village, was unaware of just how much the truth would shake the foundations of their world. As she arrived, she noticed the usual faces, curious onlookers, gossiping in small groups. The faint scent of freshly baked bread from Mrs. Treadwell's bakery drifting on the breeze. But there was something different in the air, something charged with tension and unspoken questions. Mrs. Greenway, who had been instrumental in helping Miss Marple unearth the historical records, was standing at the front, nervously clutching a stack of papers. She caught Miss Marple's eye and gave a brief nod of acknowledgement. She had no idea just how close they were to uncovering the final thread of the mystery. For her, the truth was still a vast, murky sea, with only a few pieces of the map that would lead them to safety. "Everyone is here, Miss Marple," Hawkins said, his voice tight. He walked up to her, his eyes scanning the crowd, clearly uneasy with the gravity of what was about to unfold. "Are you sure this is the right time?" Miss Marple turned to Hawkins with a reassuring smile. "The time has come, Constable. There's no more to hide." "I'm not so sure the village will see it that way," Hawkins muttered under his breath, but his face softened as he looked at her. "Still, I trust you." The crowd shifted as more villagers gathered, their murmurs rising with curiosity and concern. Miss Marple stepped forward, her presence quiet but commanding, and she looked out over the faces before her. She could see the familiar villagers, some with anxious expressions, others with faces of confusion. But behind their eyes, she could sense a growing realization that something momentous was about to happen. "Good afternoon, everyone," Miss Marple began, her voice carrying softly but clearly across the square. "I've asked you all to gather today because the time has come to speak of truths that have long been hidden. The events of the past few weeks have stirred many of you, and it's time we addressed what has been left unsaid." There was a hush in the crowd as Miss Marple continued. She could feel the weight of their attention, but she remained steady, her gaze unwavering. "Some of you may be wondering why I've called this meeting. Others may be hoping that we can return to our quiet, peaceful lives, untroubled by the shadows that have darkened our village. The truth is, we can never go back, not after what has happened." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over them. Her eyes briefly swept over the familiar faces: Hawkins, Mrs. Greenway, Mrs. Treadwell, each of them looking at her with a mixture of concern and anticipation. "The truth is that there's been a crime in our midst," Miss Marple continued, her voice firm and resolute. "A murder. And it has not been the work of some outsider, as we might have hoped. No, the truth is more complicated than that. It is a truth that reaches into the very heart of our village." She let that statement hang in the air for a moment, allowing the murmurs of disbelief to ripple through the crowd. She could see their faces, some confused, some horrified, as the realization began to settle in. The walls of their safe, predictable world were starting to crumble. I have learned, Miss Marple said slowly, that this murder was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a long-standing series of secrets, lies, and deceptions that have been woven into the fabric of our community for years. And the man who was killed, the stranger who wandered into our village, was not just a random passerby. He was someone who had come here seeking answers that threatened to expose the very people who believed they could control this village. The air in the square grew thick with tension. The villagers were shifting, whispers spreading like wildfire. Some looked shocked, others fearful, and a few seemed to sense that the ground beneath them was beginning to shift. The truth about the Darby family must now be revealed, Miss Marple continued, her voice calm but unwavering. For years, the Darbys have hidden behind their wealth and influence. They have built an empire on secrecy, manipulating people and controlling the flow of information. But it is time for all of us to know the truth. She paused, letting her words sink in. The Darby family, so revered and yet so mysterious, had been at the center of everything, and now the villagers were beginning to understand the full extent of the deception. Mrs. Darby's husband, Miss Marple said, her gaze now fixed firmly on the crowd, was involved in the illegal dealings that spanned far beyond the borders of this village. There were connections with people in the city, with figures who dealt in the black market, with criminals who have used their wealth and influence to hide the truth. And when Lillian Farnsworth's father began asking the right questions, he uncovered something that threatened to expose everything. She could see the shock and confusion on the villagers' faces. Some were whispering to one another, but Miss Marple's next words would stop them dead in their tracks. The man who was found dead, the one who wandered into our village, was none other than a private investigator, hired by Lillian's father to uncover the truth about the Darby family and their dealings. He came to St. Mary Mead to dig deeper, and he paid the ultimate price for his discovery. There was a collective gasp from the crowd as Miss Marple stood tall, knowing that she had just unveiled the most crucial piece of the puzzle. But there was more. She wasn't done yet. The murderer, Miss Marple said, her voice steady and calm, was not just anyone. The killer is someone who had everything to lose if the truth came out. And that person is someone you all know. Someone you see every day. The crowd fell, deathly silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple continued softly, you are not just a bystander. You are not just a victim of this situation. You, too, are complicit in the death of this man. For a brief moment, Mrs. Darby seemed to shrink back, as if the truth had pierced her armor. Her eyes flickered, and for the first time, Miss Marple saw the full extent of the woman's fear. But Miss Marple wasn't finished. I know you didn't act alone, Mrs. Darby, she said, her voice clear and steady. There were others involved, but it is you who have been at the center of it all. You've protected your family's empire of lies for too long, and now the village must face the consequences. The crowd remained silent, and Miss Marple could feel their shock beginning to give way to something else, a slow, creeping understanding that their village had been living a lie for far too long. The truth had come out, and it would change everything. As Miss Marple turned to leave, she knew the hardest part was still ahead. The village would never be the same. But as the truth settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction. The lies had been exposed, and now the healing could begin. Chapter 06. The village of St. Mary Mead had changed overnight. What had once been a quiet, idyllic community, its cobbled streets, a haven for gossip and mild intrigue, was now a place where the past could no longer be buried under the surface. The truth had come to light, and with it, a storm of emotions that rippled through every corner of the village. It was as if the very fabric of the place had been torn open, exposing a dark underbelly that no one had ever dared to confront. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the village square the morning after the revelation, watching as the villagers went about their business. The key, they moved slowly, as if uncertain of how to proceed in the wake of the scandal that had rocked them all. There were no casual conversations anymore, no easy chatter as they went about their daily routines. The air was thick with suspicion, guilt, and the realization that their world had been built on lies. The truth about the Darby family, their dark dealings, and the murder that had followed was now known to everyone in St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Darby had been arrested, and though she had maintained a stoic composure throughout the proceedings, Miss Marple knew that her world was unraveling. The once proud matriarch of the village was now a prisoner of her own secrets. Her confession had been a small moment of clarity, but the damage had already been done. Lillian Farnsworth, too, had found herself in the center of it all. She had returned to the village in search of answers, believing her father's death to be a tragic accident, only to discover that his death had been part of a much larger conspiracy. Her grief had been compounded by the realization that the very people who had seemed untouchable, who had lived among them, hidden in plain sight, were the ones responsible for her father's murder. As Miss Marple stood in the square, her thoughts turned to Lillian. The young woman had been through so much. Though she was determined to bring justice to her father's memory, Miss Marple knew that the road ahead would not be easy. She had uncovered the truth, yes, but what would it mean for the villagers, for Lillian, and, perhaps more poignantly, for the Darby family? She turned as a figure approached from behind Hawkins, the constable. He was looking weary, the lines on his face deeper than they had been just a few days ago. The weight of the investigation had clearly taken its toll on him. Miss Marple, he greeted her, his voice heavy. The arrests have been made. Mrs. Darby's been taken into custody, and the others are being questioned. I'm not sure what to think anymore. Miss Marple studied him for a moment, her sharp eyes taking in his tired face. You're doing your best, Hawkins. You're doing what's needed. But I sense you're struggling with something. Is it the village's reaction? The aftermath? He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. It's not just the villagers, Miss Marple. It's the entire case. All these years of lies. Who can we trust now? Who else could be involved? There's a web of connections I can't even begin to untangle. I've spent days looking through every detail, trying to make sense of it, but it feels like it keeps slipping away. Miss Marple nodded gently, her tone steady. The truth is never as clean and tidy as we might wish, Hawkins. It doesn't come with clear edges. It's like pulling a thread from an old tapestried phrase. And the more we pull, the more we uncover. What you're seeing now is only the beginning. Hawkins looked at her, his brow furrowed. But the Darbys, Mrs. Darby especially, she's been so influential here. Do you really think it's just her? There's so much more too. This, I can feel it. Of course there is, Miss Marple agreed softly. But sometimes the answers we seek are hidden in the most unlikely of places. The truth is there, Hawkins. You just need to trust the process. And remember, sometimes the people who seem the most untouchable are the ones who fall the hardest. Hawkins remained silent for a moment, his gaze distant. Finally, he spoke again, his voice tinged with a mixture of frustration and determination. I know, I just never expected St. Mary Mead to become like this. It's a village, for heaven's sake. We've always prided ourselves on our simplicity, our quiet life. Miss Marple smiled, her expression soft but knowing. The simplest lives often hold the darkest secrets, Hawkins. Don't forget that. And sometimes, the only way to truly move forward is to face those secrets head on, no matter how painful it may be. They both stood in silence for a moment, watching the villagers move about, their faces a mix of uncertainty and fear. The world they had known had been turned upside down. As the morning wore on, more villagers gathered, drawn by the need for answers and the desire to make sense of the chaos that had erupted in their midst. Miss Marple knew the time had come to act. The village could no longer remain in this state of limbo. It was time for the final pieces of the puzzle to fall into place. "Come, Hawkins," Miss Marple said after a long pause, voice firm. "There's one more conversation I need to have, okay? It's time for Lillian to know everything." Cool. They walked together to the edge of the village, where Lillian had been staying in a small cottage on the outskirts. Miss Marple had arranged to meet with her that afternoon, knowing that it was the only way to bring closure to this tangled web of lies and betrayal. When they arrived at the cottage, Lillian was waiting for them, her face a mixture of sadness and resolve. She had learned much over the past few days, but Miss Marple knew that the young woman still had more to uncover before she could truly understand the full scope of what had happened. "Miss Marple," Lillian greeted her, her voice steady despite the sorrow in her eyes. "I know why you're here. Okay. You found the truth, haven't you?" Miss Marple nodded, her expression softening. "Yes, Lillian, the truth is painful, but it must be faced. Your father's death was not an accident, as we first believed. He was murdered because he was close to uncovering something that threatened the Darby family's empire. And it was no accident that the stranger appeared in the village when he did. He was a private investigator hired by your father, someone who had come to uncover the truth about the Darbys and their connections." Lillian's face paled, her eyes filling with tears. "I should have known," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I should have seen it sooner, my father. He knew something, and now he's gone, and it's my fault." Miss Marple reached out and placed a gentle hand on Lillian's shoulder. "No, Lillian, this was not your fault. Your father did what he thought was right. Kay, he was trying to protect Yuan St. Mary Mead from the truth. But now it's up to you to carry his legacy. The truth must be told, and it will be." Lillian looked up, her expression hardening with resolve. "I'll make sure everyone knows. Won't let his death be in vain." Miss Marple smiled, glimmer of pride in her eyes. "I know you will. And when the village faces the truth, they will have you to thank for it. The truth, at last, was out in the open. The village of St. Mary Mead had been forced to confront the darkness that had been lurking beneath its surface for so long. But even as Miss Marple stood beside Lillian, watching the young woman prepare to take the next step in her journey, she knew that the village's healing was only just beginning. The truth had been exposed, and now it was time for the village to find its way forward. And as always, Miss Marple would be there, watching, waiting, and ensuring that justice, no matter how long in coming, would always prevail. The evening descended on St. Mary Mead with a sense of finality, the lingering fog creeping in over the fields as the village held its collective breath. It had been an exhausting week, a week of revelations, confessions, and the kind of truths that once whispered behind closed doors now shouted in the open. The news had spread quickly through the village, like wildfire licking through dry grass. Mrs. Darby's arrest, Lillian Farnsworth's discovery of the truth about her father's death, and the dark dealings that had been hidden for so long, these were no longer secrets. Miss Marple had done what she could. The pieces of the puzzle were finally in place, but there were still questions, still uncertainties that loomed large over the village. The Darbys, once so firmly in control of the village's wealth and reputation, were now unraveling before everyone's eyes. Mrs. Darby had confessed, and the full extent of her family's secrets was now out in the open. But, as always, the aftermath was where the true test of a community's character lay. In the square. The villagers had gathered again, this time not for a festival or a simple gossip session, but for something much heavier, the reckoning. Lillian Farnsworth had returned to the village, her father's murder no longer a mystery, but a painful reality. She had been forever changed by what she had learned, but there was strength in her now, a resolve to see justice done. The past few days had given her little time to grieve, but she had grown into something fiercer, something more determined than the grieving daughter who had first arrived. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the gathering, her sharp eyes taking in the villagers as they slowly began to assemble. They were all here, some out of genuine concern, others with an unsettling curiosity. They had all played a part in the village's story, each of them carrying their own shadows and secrets. But today, they were facing the truth. It was time for them to confront the consequences of their own silence. Lillian stepped up to the center of the square, her posture straight and her expression unreadable. She had shed the layers of sadness, replacing them with something more resolute. Her father's death would no longer be a chapter of whispers. Today, she was the one who would tell the village what had truly happened. Her words would not be easy to hear, but they needed to be heard. "Thank you all for coming," Lillian began, her voice steady, though there was a tremor beneath the calm surface. "I know this has been a difficult time for all of us, and I know that many of you have questions that you thought would never have answers." She paused, taking a deep breath as her eyes swept over the crowd. The villagers shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the truth was about to come in waves that might drown them. "My father was killed," Lillian continued, her voice carrying with an unsettling clarity. He was murdered by people who had everything to lose if the truth about their actions ever came to light. His death was not an accident, and it wasn't some random act of violence. He was silenced because he got too close to the truth about the Darby family and their involvement in illegal dealings that spanned far beyond this village. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of disbelief and understanding. Some faces flushed with guilt, others with confusion. There were gasps, some whispered exclamations, but Lillian's voice continued, broken. "Mrs. Darby's family, my father's investigations, the dark secrets that have been buried for so long in this village are all connected. My father was determined to bring those secrets to light. He had uncovered enough to know that the Darbys weren't just wealthy landowners. They were involved in something much darker, something that, if exposed, could have ruined them." Lillian's gaze shifted slightly, landing on Mrs. Darby, who stood at the back of the crowd, her hands folded tightly in front of her. The older woman looked drained, her face pale, and her eyes darted nervously around the square. She was a prisoner in her own home now, her secrets laid bare before the entire village. "Mrs. Darby," Lillian said softly, "you tried to protect your family. I understand that. But you took part in something that should never have happened. You hid the truth from all of us, and you're the reason my father is dead." Mrs. Darby's lips parted, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. The weight of Lillian's words, the finality in her voice, had already rendered her speechless. She had known this moment was coming, but she had never anticipated the raw power with which Lillian would confront her. Miss Marple watched from the sidelines, her gaze fixed on the scene before her. Lillian's strength was undeniable now, but Miss Marple knew the young woman was not yet fully aware of the toll the truth would take on her. The villagers, too, would feel the weight of this day. They had hidden in their small world of gossip and polite conversations, but now they were faced with the darkness they had allowed to fester. "There is one more thing you need to understand," Lillian said, her voice growing firmer. "This village, our home, is built on more than just the Darby family's wealth. It's built on the lies we've all allowed to fester, the things we've all ignored. You've all let this happen, whether you realized it or not." The villagers fell silent, many of them shifting uncomfortably. Some lowered their heads in shame, while others seemed to brace themselves, unsure of what to do next. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice steady and calm. "Lillian is right," she said, her eyes sweeping over the gathered crowd. We all have a part to play in what happened. None of us are innocent. But now, it's time for all of us to own up to our roles. We cannot continue pretending that everything is fine. The truth must come out, no matter how difficult it is to face. There was a long pause, and then, almost as if on cue, Mrs. Treadwell, the baker's wife, spoke up. "What do we do now, Miss Marple? What happens to the Darbys? To Lillian? To all of us?" Miss Marple looked at her, her eyes filled with quiet resolve. "We rebuild. But we rebuild on the foundation of truth. The Darby family's influence is over now, but the village will survive. It will heal, but only if we stop hiding from what's been done." Lillian nodded, her expression somber but resolute. "I don't want revenge, Miss Marple. I just want the truth to be known. I want my father's death to mean something. I don't want it to be buried with the lies. Your father's death will never be forgotten," Miss Marple said softly. "Nor will the truth that you've brought to light today. This village, for all its flaws, will learn from this. The past may be painful, but the future can be different." With that, Lillian turned back to the crowd, her shoulders squared, her gaze steady. "I will not let this village forget what it owes my father. And I will not let the Darby family secrets be forgotten." Miss Marple stood in the background, watching the villagers slowly disperse. She felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The truth had come out, and now it was up to them to decide what kind of village they would become. The secrets that had once defined St. Mary Mead were now out in the open. And with that exposure came the painful but necessary journey toward healing. The truth, Miss Marple knew, was not always easy to bear, but it was always the key to freedom. And as she walked away from the square, she knew that for the first time in a long while, St. Mary Mead was truly free, that ChatGPT said. Chapter 07. The Village of St. Mary, Agatha. Mead seemed almost eerily quiet in the days following the revelation of the Darby family's dark past. The streets, once filled with gossip and light-hearted chatter, were now heavy with a new awareness, a palpable tension that made even the simplest exchanges feel fraught with meaning. The villagers had learned the truth about the murder, the secrets, and the web of corruption that had taken root in their quiet community. And though the knowledge of what had been hidden for so long weighed heavily on everyone, there was also an undeniable sense of anticipation in the air. Miss Marple, ever observant, had noticed a shift in the way people moved through the village. No longer were the smiles as frequent, nor the greetings as warm. People spoke in hushed tones, and when their gazes met, they lingered just a moment too long. It was as though the past had caught up with them, and they weren't sure how to move forward. Of the villagers had come to terms with the truth, their shock turning into determination to rebuild. Others, however, still harbored doubts, unsure of how to reconcile their complicity in allowing the Darby family's reign of secrecy to continue. For so long, Miss Marple had her own role to play in the aftermath. Her ability to see through the veil of deception and focus on the deeper truths had allowed the village to confront what had been lurking beneath the surface for so many years. But now, as the weight of the secrets had been revealed, it was time for the final reckoning. It was time for St. Mary Mead to confront the consequences of its actions, and for the village to heal. Lillian Farnsworth, though still grieving the loss of her father, had become the village's quiet voice of change. She had stood before them, resolute and unflinching, her father's death no longer just a tragic accident, but a turning point for the entire community. She had taken on the mantle of justice, vowing to ensure that the Darby family's influence would no longer cloud the village's future. Her strength was undeniable, though Miss Marple could see the strain it placed on her. The weight of this truth, the responsibility of her father's legacy, was something that Lillian would carry for the rest of her life. But Miss Marple knew that the village would need more than just the truth. It would need understanding. It would need time and, most importantly, It would need unity. The healing process had begun, but it was far from complete. As the week passed, the village gathered once more in the square, this time for a meeting of a different kind. The mood was less somber than it had been when Miss Marple had first revealed the truth, but it was still charged with the lingering effects of the past few days. Villagers stood in small groups, talking amongst themselves, but there was a sense of anticipation in the air. It was as if everyone was waiting for something, waiting for a resolution, for a final reckoning. Miss Marple was there, of course, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. Hawkins, the constable, had organized the meeting, and as he stepped forward to address the crowd, his presence seemed to anchor the moment. He was still a man caught between duty and the overwhelming weight of the situation. But today, there was a new determination in his stance. "Thank you all for coming," Hawkins began, his voice steady. As you all know, the past few days have been difficult for all of us. The truths we've uncovered have shaken this village to its core. We've learned of the Darby family's involvement in illegal dealings, the murder that was covered up, and the lies that have festered in our midst for far too long. But today, we must look forward. He paused for a moment, letting his words settle over the crowd. We cannot undo what has been done. We cannot bring back those we've lost, nor can we erase the mistakes of the past. But what we can do is rebuild. We can work together to make sure that this village, our village, never loses its sense of community again. We can ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. The crowd murmured in agreement, and Miss Marple, standing at the back of the gathering, felt a quiet pride. Hawkins was right. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about making sure that the truth led to a better future. One built on honesty, integrity, the strength of the village's community. Lillian Farnsworth stepped forward, her expression resolute. She had been the one to carry the burden of revealing the truth, and now she would take the final step in ensuring that the village could heal. "Thank you, Constable," Lillian said, her voice clear and strong. "I never imagined that I would be standing here today, facing the very people who have spent their lives in this village. I never imagined that my father's death would lead to something so much larger, but here we are, and I believe that we have a chance to make things right." Her gaze swept over the crowd, her eyes locking onto various faces, some of them familiar, others still clouded by the past. "I know that many of you are angry, confused, or even ashamed of what has come to light, but I ask you, what matters now is how we move forward. We have the opportunity to rebuild this village together, to make sure that the truth we've uncovered doesn't tear us apart, but brings us closer." Miss Marple watched Lillian closely, noting the subtle tremor in her hands, the slight quiver in her voice. But she could also see the strength in her, the resolve to not let her father's death be in vain. She was, after all, a product of this village, the daughter of a man who had fought for what was right, no matter the cost. And now, Lillian was carrying on that fight in her own way. "It's not just the Darby family secrets that we've uncovered," Lillian continued, her voice unwavering. "It's the complacency we've all allowed to fester, the silence we've kept. We've been a part of something that should never have existed. But we can change that. We can make this village what it was meant to, be honest, open, and true." There was a long silence after her words, the villagers taking in her speech, processing the weight of her message. Miss Marple could see the shift, the quiet nods of agreement, the subtle change in the way they regarded one another. The truth had forced them to confront themselves, but it was also the catalyst for something much more important, the possibility of redemption. Mrs. Darby, who had been quietly sitting at the back of the crowd, her hands folded in her lap, stood slowly and approached the front. Her once proud demeanor had withered under the weight of her confession. But Miss Marple could see the quiet acceptance in her now. "I've had my share of guilt," Mrs. Darby said, her voice trembling slightly. Tay, and I know that what I did cannot be undone. But I am here today to say that I will do whatever it takes to help make things right. I will stand by Lillian in this village, no matter the cost. Her words, though heavy with the burden of regret, seemed to be the final piece of the puzzle. The Darby family's reign of secrecy had come to an end, but Mrs. Darby's willingness to step forward, to face the consequences of her actions, was a small but important step toward the healing the village so desperately needed. As the crowd began to disperse, Miss Marple stood at the edge of the square, watching as the villagers slowly returned to their lives. The healing would take time, of that Miss Marple was certain. But the first steps had been taken. The village had faced its truth, and in doing so, it had been given the chance to rebuild. Miss Marple turned and made her way home, her thoughts swirling. The mystery had been solved, but it was more than that. Tid had been a turning point for the village. And, though the road ahead would be long, Miss Marple knew that St. Mary Mead would never be the same again. It had been a difficult journey, but as always, the truth had prevailed. And in the end, that was what mattered most. ChatGPT said the days following the village meeting were quieter, but not in the way Miss Marple had expected. Instead of the heavy air of suspicion and fear, there was a certain stillness of silence that settled like a fog over the village, as though it were bracing itself for what was to come. The truth had been exposed, and while the villagers had begun to face the consequences of their complicity in the Darby family's secrets, the long road to healing had only just begun. Miss Marple had always known that the truth, no matter how carefully buried, would eventually rise to the surface. And now that it had, the village was left to grapple with it. The Darby family, once seen as the cornerstone of St. Mary Mead's social structure, was crumbling before their eyes. Mrs. Darby's confession had been the first step, but the real work was in rebuilding the shattered community. Some villagers, like Mrs. Treadwell and Mrs. Greenway, were eager to move forward, determined to rebuild the village's sense of trust. Others, however, remained hesitant, unsure of how to proceed in a world that had suddenly seemed so uncertain. Miss Marple had always been an observer, a quiet participant in the lives of those around her. But this time, she felt something different, something more profound. The truth was not simply a matter of justice. It was about redemption. The village had been given a second chance, and how they chose to use it would define the future of St. Mary Mead. The morning after the village meeting, Miss Marple walked through the streets of the village, her steps slow and deliberate. The cobblestones beneath her feet seemed to echo with the ghosts of the past, the weight of years of silence and hidden truths. As she passed the baker's shop, Mrs. Treadwell greeted her with a warm smile, her eyes bright despite the heaviness of recent events. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Mrs. Treadwell said cheerfully. "I've been meaning to thank you for all you've done. I know it wasn't easy, but you've given us all the chance to make things right." Miss Marple nodded politely, but her gaze remained distant as she scanned the quiet street. "Thank you, Mrs. Treadwell, but remember, the real work is just beginning. The truth is not always an easy thing to face, but it is the only way forward. Mrs. Treadwell looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You're right, of course, but it feels as though we've been given a chance, doesn't it? The Darbys are gone, and now we have to make sure their shadow doesn't linger over us any longer." Miss Marple smiled softly, though her eyes betrayed a hint of sadness. "The past will always have its place in our lives, Mrs. Treadwell, but it's how we move forward that matters most. The village will heal in time. It will take patience and understanding." As Miss Marple continued her walk, she passed the familiar faces of other villagers. Some gave her nods of recognition, while others seemed to avoid her gaze, still unsure of how to process the changes. It wasn't just the Darby family's fall from grace that had shaken them. It was the realization that they, too, had been complicit in turning a blind eye. The village had allowed these secrets to fester for years. Now, they were faced with the consequences. Miss Marple reached her cottage and paused at the door, her hand resting on the brass handle. She stood there for a moment, deep in thought, before stepping inside. Her quiet home was a sanctuary, a place where she could retreat from the chaos of the world outside. But even here, the echoes of the past lingered. She took a seat by the window, watching as the villagers went about their day. It had been a long time since she had seen such a collective sense of uncertainty, but there was also a flicker of hope in the air. They were trying to find their footing again, to rebuild something that had been broken. And in that, Miss Marple saw a glimmer of the village's resilience. Her thoughts turned to Lillian Farnsworth. The young woman had shown incredible strength. In the face of everything she had learned about her father's death and the Darby family's involvement, Miss Marple had spoken to her several times since the meeting, offering what comfort she could. But Lillian's path was not an easy one. She had been forced to confront the painful reality of her father's murder and the corruption that had been allowed to fester for so long. But Miss Marple believed that, in time, Lillian would find peace. The village had a way of healing, and Lillian would be at the heart of that healing. As the day wore on, Miss Marple felt a quiet sense of resolution settling over her. The mystery had been solved, the truth uncovered, but the work of healing was far from over. It would take time for the villagers to rebuild trust. Time for Lillian to find the peace she so desperately sought, and time for Miss Marple herself to reflect on the role she had played in it all. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the village square once more, her steps slow and measured. The square was busier now, with people going about their daily routines. But today, there was something different in the air. The weight of the past no longer seemed to hang over the village quite as heavily. The truth had been spoken, and now it was time for St. Mary Mead to move forward. As Miss Marple approached the center of the square, she spotted Lillian sitting on a bench, her hands clasped in her lap as she gazed out over the village. Miss Marple approached quietly, taking a seat beside her. "You're looking better today, Lillian," Miss Marple said gently, her voice filled with warmth. "How are you holding up?" Lillian looked at her with a soft smile, though her eyes were still shadowed by the grief she carried. "I'm doing as well as can be expected, Miss Marple. The past few days have been overwhelming, but I know what my father would have wanted. He fought for the truth, and now it's up to me to make sure that it's not buried again." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "You've shown incredible strength, Lillian. I'm proud of you. Your father's legacy will not be forgotten." Lillian's smile faded slightly as she turned her gaze back to the village. "It's just so hard to know where to begin. The village is so different now. The people, the way they look at me. It's like everything has changed, and I'm not sure how to fit into this new world." Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on Lillian's shoulder. "Change is difficult, Lillian. It always is. But you are not alone. The village will find its way, and so will you. You're part of the heart of St. Mary Mead, whether you realize it or not." Lillian sighed, a long breath that seemed to carry the weight of her thoughts. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive, Miss Marple. I don't know if I can ever let go of the anger I feel, but I want to try." "That's all anyone can do," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. "Forgiveness is a slow process, Lillian, but it's the only way forward." The two women sat in silence for a few moments, watching as the village carried on around them. The past was still there, lingering in the air like the faintest echo, but the future was beginning to take shape. The village had been forced to confront its darkest secrets, and now it was beginning to rebuild as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden light over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. The mystery had been solved, but more importantly, the village had been given the chance to heal. It was a long road ahead, but Miss Marple was confident that in time, St. Mary Mead would find its way back to the peace it had once known. And, as always, Miss Marple would be there, watching, waiting, and ready to help guide them toward the light. Seeing Mary Mead had never quite been the same since the revelations. The village, with its cobbled streets and quiet lanes, had always been a place where little was hidden. Gossip traveled quickly, and secrets were rare. But even in a place so seemingly transparent, the truth about the Darby family had been buried for decades, hidden beneath layers of respectability and old money charm. Now, with the veil pulled back, the village was left to reckon with the consequences of the past, and, perhaps more importantly, to shape its future. Miss Marple stood in the square once more, her eyes scanning the familiar streets, watching as the villagers went about their business. The weight of the mystery she had unraveled still hung in the air, but there was something different about the way people moved now. The nervousness, the unease, had faded somewhat. They had faced the truth, after all, and though it had not been easy, they had done so together, and in doing so, they had taken the first step toward rebuilding what had been broken. Lillian Farnsworth was no longer the quiet, grieving daughter who had first arrived in St. Mary Mead. She had grown in strength and conviction. Her father's death no longer just a painful memory, but a catalyst for change. She had faced the truth head-on, no matter the cost. The village, once unaware of the extent of its own complicity, had now been forced to confront its own silence. It was an uncomfortable truth, but it was a necessary one. And with it, Lillian had found a kind of peace, though Miss Marple knew it would take time for her to fully heal. The conversation between Miss Marple and Lillian in the square that day had been quiet but meaningful. They had sat together, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between them. Lillian, now more composed, had spoken of the future, of how she planned to make her father's death matter, to honor his legacy by ensuring the village learned from its mistakes. "I've been thinking about what you said, Miss Marple," Lillian had said softly, her voice steady, "about rebuilding, about making things right. It's not going to be easy, but I think it's the only way forward. I want to see the village move past this, to rebuild what we had, even if we don't know exactly what that looks like." Miss Marple had smiled kindly at her. "The road ahead won't be easy, Lillian, but the village will be stronger for it. You've shown everyone here the importance of facing the truth, even when it's painful. That's something worth holding on to." Now, weeks later, the air seemed lighter, the village beginning to emerge from the shadow of its past. Miss Marple had been watching the changes, though she remained as quietly observant as ever. The Darby family's fall from grace had shaken the village to its core, but it had also forced people to reckon with their own actions. The whispers of complicity had begun to fade, replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. People had come to understand that change, while difficult, was sometimes necessary. Mrs. Darby, so now imprisoned for her role in the conspiracy, had become a symbol of what happens when power and wealth are left unchecked. Miss Marple had no doubt that her fall would be remembered in the village's history, a warning to future generations that no one, no matter how untouchable they seemed, was immune to the truth. And yet, for all the pain and turmoil that had unfolded, there was something healing about the process. The village had found a new sense of unity in the wake of the Darby family's exposure. The bonds that had once been strained by lies and deceit were slowly being repaired. Thread by thread, Miss Marple had spent much of her time in the days that followed the events, quietly watching as the villagers began to turn toward one another. Once again, people had started to take responsibility for the role they had played in allowing the Darbys to maintain their grip on the village for so long. There were conversations now, deep and meaningful, were there, had once been polite nods and small talk. The villagers were no longer just neighbors, bound by proximity. They were allies, working together to build something better. But Miss Marple knew better than anyone that this process would not be quick. Rebuilding trust took time, and while the villagers were on the right path, they still had a long way to go. It would take patience, understanding, and most importantly, your willingness to face the past without flinching. As the days turned into weeks, Miss Marple took a walk through the village one afternoon, a rare moment of quiet reflection for herself. The sun was setting, casting a soft, golden glow over the village. She paused near the edge of the square, watching the children playing in the streets, their laughter filling the air. The world was moving on, as it always did, but for St. Mary Mead, everything had changed. The truth had come out, and the village was beginning to find its way again. Miss Marple paused for a moment, watching the bustle of the square. She could see Mrs. Treadwell talking to Mrs. Greenway by the bakery, both women laughing over a shared joke. The tension between them had eased in the weeks since the revelations, and there was a sense of camaraderie in their exchange that had once been absent. It was these small moments that told Miss Marple everything she needed to know about the village's progress. She made her way to the local pub, where a group of villagers had gathered, exchanging news and stories. They paused as she entered, but Miss Marple smiled and nodded at them, greeting familiar faces as she moved to the bar. Mr. Pierce, the barman, greeted her with a warm smile. "Good evening, Miss Marple," he said. "It's good to see you. Out and about. Things are looking a bit brighter around here, aren't they?" Miss Marple smiled, though her eyes held a quiet wisdom. "They are, Mr. Pierce. The village is healing, slowly but surely. It always does, in its own way." "You're right there," Mr. Pierce agreed. "It's been a rough time for everyone, but I think we're finally starting to move forward. The past can't be changed, but we're not going to let it define us." Miss Marple nodded, taking a sip of her tea. "Past will always be with us," she said thoughtfully, "but it's up to us how we let it shape our future." As she left the pub, Miss Marple felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The village had faced its darkest secrets, and now it was moving toward something better. Lillian Farnsworth had shown them the way, and the village had responded, slowly but surely. They were learning to rebuild, to make amends, and to move forward as a community. Miss Marple knew that there would always be mysteries to solve, always more stories to uncover. But for now, St. Mary Mead was at peace. The truth had been revealed, and the healing had begun. The village had been changed, and though the scars of the past would never fully fade, Miss Marple was content in the knowledge that St. Mary Mead was on the path to a brighter future. And as she walked home, the evening sky now painted in shades of purple and gold, Miss Marple knew one thing for certain: the village would always find its way back, no matter the storm. Because, in the end, truth and resilience would always win out.